Oh, yeah. Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Shakil Khan. I'm delighted to be presenting at Algo 2020 today. And I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm an AI capability building lead at HMRC, as well as co-founder of Validate AI. And I'm really pleased to be co-presenting with academics and practitioners in the field today. And today we've got Ed Humferson, who's Director General of Office for Statistical Regulation, with Emily too as well. So thank you both. I know you're incredibly busy at the moment, so thanks for joining us today. And we've also got Professor David Hand and Phillip Trevelyan, and I'll talk a little bit more about their backgrounds later on. So the session is going to be split into two. We're going to have a 30-minute presentation followed by 30-minute panel session. And I'll just proceed now into the presentation slides. So just a little bit of background about myself. My role over the last 5 years has very much been about looking outward beyond HMRC and understanding what's going on in terms of innovation in academia and in industry, but particularly with academic partners who are actually very active in the private sector field, bringing those ideas back into government. Thanks, Emily. If you can move to the next slide. So I mentioned about Validate AI, and Validate AI came about in 2019 through conversations and really a celebration of the democratization of AI developments. And, you know, we see now as a result of open source technology that AI developments are happening across a diverse set of applications. And that's great news. But what we did highlight as a result of that is due to the proliferation comes risks in terms of the safety, the ethical aspects, robustness, and the relevance of these AI systems and maintaining these AI systems. So it was felt that we needed to come together and talk about these various issues. And we had our inaugural conference for Validate AI at the Royal Society in November 2019. And the objective of that conference was to bring together practitioners and academics from as I say, a diverse set of fields, applying AI methodologies in health, in autonomous driving, in government, in HMRC. So as a result of that gathering, you know, we regarded it as a great success, and we then launched our first white paper that articulated some of the issues around AI validation, and hence kind of our operating model for Validate AI. And, you know, a key component of this model was this collaborative working, which we call triple helix. And I'll elaborate a bit more about that on the next slide. Emily, if you can move to the next slide. So in terms of capability building, I regard this as kind of a three-pronged approach. Firstly, in terms of the phases of development for an organization, and also in terms of knowledge and advancement, and differentiating explicit and tacit forms of knowledge advancement. And then thirdly, in terms of this triple helix concept. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these stages. So in terms of identification while you're developing capability, that's incredibly important. And it's really important to look beyond the particular team, organization that you work on, because you know what you know and you don't know what you don't know. So, you know, as I say, a fundamental part of my role at HMRC has been looking outwards as to what's going on in the field. And really where we find inspiration and ideas in terms of AI methodology, we adopt those principles. And I'll go on further on in the presentation to elaborate on how the Predictive Analytics Handbook at HMRC was inspired by some of the processes in banking in particular, where we can't adopt easily. We then promote innovation. So innovation in terms of trying new methodologies out and testing these principles and seeing whether they fit for our organization or not. And the collaboration for Validate AI is very much about bringing in that tacit knowledge around deployment of AI systems, a lot of which isn't captured in texts or online. So, having that iterative dialogue is very important for us. And then thirdly, this concept of triple helix that's been written about quite extensively by Henry Etzkovitz at Stanford University. And he describes how this collaborative approach between academics, industry and government can bring about massive societal benefit. So that's something that underpins what we do at Validate AI. So that's just a quick introduction. And on that note, I'm going to pass you over to Ed, who's going to talk a little bit more about building trust and public confidence. So thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to give a few initial remarks about our work at the Office for Statistics Regulation, OSR, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Emily, who leads on automation and technology for us. So who are we? Well, in a simple sentence, we are the public sector body responsible for the public life of data and statistics in the UK. In formal terms, we are the regulatory arm of the UK Statistics Authority. In practical terms, we set the standards for official statistics in the UK through a code of practice for statistics. And in outcome terms, our focus is always on supporting public confidence in statistics and data. So as I say, we are focused always on how statistics, data, quantified information that emerges from the public sector can command the confidence of the public in the UK. And our principal tool is the code of practice. If we could just move on, Emily, that would be great. I think from that vantage point, in terms of public confidence in statistics and data, I'd separate out three separate waves of public concern with quite distinct drivers. And in some ways, this is akin to the way people in the AI world talk about the separate winters of AI. It's slightly, the timeframes don't overlap, but I think the idea that you get these different waves of interest is quite consistent. So the first wave is probably the period 2000 to 2008 in the UK, when I think the basic trust in the governance of statistics was under question. There was a public concern that statistics on things like unemployment were compiled to suit the government of the day and were not compiled under the independent judgment of professional statisticians. Now, whether or not that's a correct diagnosis is one thing. The point is it led to a response, and the response it led to in 2008 was the creation of my parents' organisation, the UK Statistics Authority, and the first statutory code of practice. So the problem was with governance, and the solution was better governance through an independent statistics authority and a statutory code of practice. Second wave of concern from about 2013 to about 2016 was not so much on the governance of statistics, but whether the data, the statistics published, really faithfully reflected the society we live in. For example, whether crime statistics really gave a fair picture of the level of crime, whether economic statistics really captured the nature of the economy. And this wave of concern led to the Bean Review of Economic Statistics, which published in 2016, and the creation of a separate Office for Statistics Regulation, which I head up. So that's really the second wave. I think that we are now in a third wave of public concern, and this is not about the basic trust in the governance. It's not about whether statistics reflect society. It's whether statistical models used in public decision making are used appropriately and fairly. And the kind of most significant event in that wave of concern has been the way that exam grades were awarded in the summer of 2020 by exam bodies in the United Kingdom, A levels and so on, using algorithms, using automated algorithms. And lots of concern about whether those algorithms are mutant and whether they let people down. And I wonder whether this third wave of concern is going to lead to a new response, just as the first two waves did. And I suspect that third wave of concern will lead to much strengthened guidance, frameworks, checklists, practical help to enable public bodies to do things with AI to support decisions in a way that can command public confidence. That's what I suspect. Let's see what you will make of it. And I think Emily is going to unpack this notion of public confidence and of guidelines a bit more. Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, so kind of just to highlight then further on kind of why public confidence matters really. And I've kind of, to do this, I've got kind of three headlines from relatively recent headlines around BBC News headlines around algorithms. And it's interesting here to just kind of see some of the words that are being used. So racist, mutant algorithm, unlawful. And obviously algorithms can only work successfully if they're trusted and accepted by those who are affected by them and who use them. So in these kind of examples, even one algorithm that is being kind of poorly designed and therefore it decreases public trust could cause problems for other algorithms in the public sector due to the kind of public backlash. So even kind of the word algorithm being used in these ways in headlines can then, you know, decrease public trust and cause issues with other algorithms. And we really don't want to be in a position where no government algorithms are trusted by the public because they weren't held up to the required standard, because we know that there are a lot of potential benefits of these kind of algorithms in AI within government and the public sector, costs and, you know, the increased insight that they can bring to just kind of be two of the main kind of benefits. And you can see that, so Ed mentioned the exam algorithm that happened during the summer. Kind of once there was a backlash, once, you know, that had some negative press around it, it almost didn't matter when kind of Wales and Northern Ireland released, you know, their algorithms because or their approach, because they were already tarnished with the same brush as maybe, you know, England and Scotland were at that point when theirs came out. So how do standards and frameworks really help us with this issue of public confidence then? So really what they help to instill is kind of the trustworthiness, quality and value into a project. And that's kind of the three pillars within the code of practice that we at OSR kind of try and push and are kind of the underlying pillars in the code. So trustworthiness then is kind of, you don't seek trust, you kind of try to provide evidence that you are trustworthy. And if you have a standard and you're kind of open about that standard and you've got a framework that you're kind of being open about and saying this is how we structure what we do, then you're providing evidence that you're trustworthy because you're being open about what your how you do it and the processes and the ways that you work. You've got quality then, so ensuring that the data and methods you use are not misleading. So obviously, a lot of these standards, frameworks and checklists will include things around quality and things that need to be considered. And the more practical guidance will also ensure that the quality is appropriate for the project. So that's also built in within frameworks. And then value is kind of around focusing on the questions that people want to answer. And a lot of the projects, a lot of AI kind of sometimes focuses on what can we do, what is the new, you know, jazzy thing that we can produce. but maybe don't kind of take it a step back and be like, well, actually, what is the user need? What is the value in what we're actually producing, and what will the public acceptability be around this model that we're doing? So this is something that frameworks bring in, and I've seen in a lot of frameworks this is something that's like right at the forefront of these kind of guides, and therefore that's why it kind of brings it. Makes guidance and framework quite important in that sense. So just want to kind of explore the kind of different types of frameworks that are out there, and guides. So the first ones, you've got kind of general frameworks, so those that are high level, and they cover many different considerations and principles. You've got specific frameworks, so those that really focus on a particular topic or a particular issue. And then you've got the practical guidance, or something, sometimes you would kind of call these checklists as well, in that they are practical things to consider and steps to take. So this is guidance that focuses on implementation and specific considerations. So I think it's fair to say as well that the order of these also takes into account how prevalent they are. So there's quite a lot of general frameworks that are around. Maybe sort of less specific frameworks that go into specific issues, and then even less maybe practical guidance. And obviously Shaquille's going to be talking a little bit around one of those examples of practical guidance in a bit. And these kind of help in different ways, I think. So what I'm going to do now is just give a real example of maybe each one of these from work that we've been doing and what we've been using within OSR recently. So the example of a kind of general framework is the Government Digital Services Data Ethics Framework. And this guides users through the appropriate responsible data use in government and the wider public sector. And the reason why it's general is because it really has these overarching principles that they are applicable throughout the entire project. So transparency, accountability, and fairness, which are obviously also things that are really relevant to the code of practice within OSR as well. But as well as being general, they also have kind of specific actions, but they cover the whole project life cycle. So the first is kind of defining and understanding public benefit and user need, which is obviously the value, where value comes in, involving diverse expertise, complying with the law, reviewing the quality and limitation of data. So they're all kind of general principles, but there's lots of these kind of guides, and they provide a good overview of the whole process. And then this is an example of a kind of specific framework that we kind of find quite useful. And it's talking really about the explainability and explaining decisions made with AI. And it's from the ICO and in the Alan Turing Institute. And they set out kind of good practice for explaining decisions and individuals, so that individuals have made, the explanations that individuals want about decisions made with AI. And it says about these 5 conceptual factors of why individuals may want something explained, and it kind of goes into detail. But the point is that it really just is around explainability, which is a big kind of important factor within AI at the moment. And then we're going on to kind of, I think this is your slide, Shaquille, but moving on to kind of more practical guidance, I was just going to kind of introduce Shaquille here to talk about the Predictive Analytics Handbook that they're producing in HMRC.
Thanks for that, Emily. And I think one of the challenges with producing standards and frameworks is that there's a lot of guidance out there, but it seems to be more considerations. So how can we move into the practitioner-centric checklists that may be more integrated in the life cycle of delivering AI systems? So Emily, if you can move to the next slide, thank you. So what I'd like to do is just share with you, share with you the Predictive Analytics Handbook, which I guess AI has been considered as a form of predictive technology. And prior to joining HMRC, I worked in the banking sector for some time, where standards and frameworks and checklists were an integral part of how we developed and deployed AI systems. So I guess, you know, it's analogous to what maybe a surgeon may do prior to surgery with their team, making sure that they work down a checklist before operating on a patient. So, you know, the use of checklists demonstrates the importance of quality assurance in the process. So what we did with HMRC is I realized that there was a great opportunity to adopt some of those frameworks that I was using in the banking sector and effectively promote that trust of the AI system that we were proposing to deploy. And the way the Predictive Analytics Handbook came about and how it was developed was through various consultations within HMRC and across other government departments, and indeed with academics as well. So very much drawing in that tacit knowledge of deployment, which you don't ordinarily find in texts, and effectively migrating kind of best practice from, in this case, financial sector to government. And, you know, really, as I said earlier, adoption means not reinventing the wheel, but just taking on what's already there and then building on those strong foundations. At the moment, we're going through the third iteration of the PA handbook, and effectively what we're questioning constantly is we're not being complacent with the status quo. We're trying to innovate on these standards as a living document. And I think that's really important to stress that, you know, what we're not advocating is kind of procedures that are fixed in time, but they need to evolve organically as the technology evolves as well. So sorry, Emily, if you move on to the next slide. So just very quickly, one part of the handbook is around post-deployment considerations and the maintenance of these AI systems. And something that's very kind of apt at this moment in time is population stability, and whether the population that you're applying the AI system to is representative or similar to the population on which you developed the AI system in the first place. If that condition isn't adhered to, then you may find that the AI system is no longer fit for purpose. So what these metrics, and the population stability index is one of those measures, does is it looks at the what we call population drift, the movement in the underlying population, and seeing whether the AI system is still relevant or not. So Emily, if you move on to the next slide, thank you. So again, this is straight from an earlier version of the Predictive Analytics Handbook, and what it suggests in terms of measuring relevance is a series of metrics to look at AI stability versus AI efficiency. So in the AI stability section of the checks are measures to do with this, what I call population drift. So, you know, I've touched on PSI. Other metrics may be forms of transition matrices, or what we call mean points difference. So that's all looking at whether there's been a shift in the underlying population. If there has been a shift, it may indicate that the AI system is no longer fit for purpose, or it may not. But what the efficiency measures do then is look at whether, in more detail, whether the predictive analytics or the AI system is still fit for purpose. And it looks at a whole myriad of diagnostics, from the KS statistic, log odds relationships, etc., etc. So I guess the key takeaway message from this slide is, when you are looking at AI systems, you're looking at a dashboard approach, and you're looking at the metrics holistically and not in isolation, and effectively what we would like to do is automate these processes. And I think that's the next stage of the journey for HMRC, and ultimately summarize those metrics as a traffic light system where, for example, a red may indicate that the AI system is no longer fit for purpose, and an amber may indicate that there may need to be some form of recalibration of the system. So this is kind of what we're advocating. Yes, next slide, Emily. Yeah, so in our conversations with UCL and researchers from Phillip's team, they've developed an AI assurance audit process that they're still prototyping with various organizations. And effectively what this does is it effectively manages an assessment process within these organizations and applies standards and regulations to those assessments. And this circle represents the organizations and the sectors that they belong to that are being prototyped. And the eventual objective of this process is potentially some form of certification of that AI system that is fit for purpose, or indeed it may be a mechanism for underwriting the AI system and mitigating the risks through revenue losses as an insurance mechanism. So, you know, that's really exciting research that's ongoing with UCL, and watch this space as to where that goes next. Emily, the next slide. Thank you. So as I say, Validate AI was very much born from looking at some of the technical aspects of AI development and posing questions around whether the AI system has been defined in the right way at scoping stage, whether the AI system manages the software bugs effectively, whether the underlying data is representative, etc., etc. And, you know, I've talked about whether the AI system is sufficiently accurate through a dashboard approach to metrics. So what we're asking for from the audience today is, you know, what form of standards and frameworks do you use in your organizations? And we'd like you to be a part of this consultation process at Validate AI. And any thoughts you may have about the subject matter, please do contact us at contact@validateai.org. So thank you for that. And on that note, I finished the presentation phase of this session and move on to the panel session. And I'd like to introduce Professor David Hand from Imperial College London first. Both David and Phillip have you know, amazing list of accolades that I could work through, and I could spend a long time doing so. But very briefly, David is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at Imperial College London. He was also president of the Royal Statistical Society twice and has written many books, I think 29 books in total, maybe, David. And his most recent book on dark data is very relevant to this subject matter. And thank you, David, for joining us today. And if you could share with us your thoughts around standards and frameworks and indeed validating AI. Thank you very much, David.
Okay. Thank you very much. In fact, it's 31 books now, and if I can just advertise them.
Amazing stuff.
Thanks very much. Those were wonderful introductory presentations. They raised all sorts of issues. What I want to do, I've only got a few minutes, is to dig down into a particular direction and really look at how we do it rather than what we're trying to do. So I'm going to say a little bit about checklists themselves. Humans aren't perfect. We forget things, we overlook things, we dismiss things, we ignore things. And given the increasing complexity of human society and the situations confronting us, the opportunity for those sorts of oversights is just constantly growing. So we need to ask ourselves how we can improve our ability to cope with complex systems. And one very valuable tool is the humble checklist. just a step-by-step list of signs to look out for and stages to go through. Some of you will be familiar with Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto. I have to say, when I first saw that book, I wondered how on earth one could write a whole book about so elementary a tool. But if you haven't read it, I recommend it, not only because it's a gripping read, funnily enough, but also because it provides a very valuable insight into how to construct effective checklists. There's an old saying that the devil's in the details, and that's really the point about checklists. They take a high-level view down into the details, and then by virtue of their sort of essentially linear structure, force you to go through those details so that you miss nothing, and they ensure consistency, or at least that's what well-designed ones do. But checklists aren't something that can be thrown together in a sort of casual Sunday afternoon, back of the envelope scribbling. They require painstaking construction and rigorous testing. Indeed, you might go so far as to say that constructing a checklist requires a checklist to be sure you haven't omitted anything critical. Now, I think good checklists have three basic kinds of items: checks for signs, symptoms, indicators, and measurements, and so on, so you can see what's happening. Then second, actions that need to be taken. And then thirdly, verifications that actions have been taken and that the objectives or targets have been achieved. There are two fundamental risks to the effectiveness of checklists: excessive length and woolly items. You can tackle the first by splitting checklists into chunks, smaller checklists. And one way to minimize the second is to make the items as concrete as possible. Ask for numerical answers if you like. I suppose there's another danger, that a physical manifestation of a checklist is often a list of questions along with a box to be ticked, and that can sort of stimulate a tick box mentality. So having unambiguous items with clear possible responses can help to reduce that risk. There is an excellent high-level checklist which was mentioned in the Q&A a moment ago, which has been produced for AI systems, which has been produced by the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence set up by the European Commission, and I recommend that. I have a particular interest, as some of you know, in data aspects, and I've got a series of high-level questions that I use, as it were, for my sort of initial checklist. I can go through those later. I don't really have time now, but they start with things like, do you know the source of the data? Do you know how they were collected? Are the data really needed to answer the question you really want to ask, and so on. I think particular contexts, just sort of winding up, particular contexts will require additional items on the checklist. So, for example, producing a data set for training a decision-making AI in a commercial context might ask if all the records have a date stamp, whereas a date stamp will be less necessary in medical applications, for example, producing a medical diagnostic AI system, for example. And just one final point, which I think is important. We're discussing checklists for AI validation here, but remember that it's critical to keep a human in the loop. Checklists are just a tool to help. They're not a complete answer. Thanks. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Philip now.
Thanks for that, David. That's a really useful overview there. So I'd just like to introduce Philip very quickly. Philip is Professor of Computing at UCL and Director of the Financial Computing Center. Philip is known for pioneering the use of computational techniques in financial services, and has worked in the areas of algorithmic trading and automated fraud detection. And I could go on and on with in terms of Philip's accolades, but I'll stop there. So thank you, Philip, for joining us today.
I also ran the National Sizing Survey, and we measured 11,000 UK adults with 3D body scanners for the clothing industry. So if anybody wants to ask me about fashion, I'd be happy to have questions on that area. Well, following David, 31 books, I feel intimidated. Congratulations. I think my contributions are going to be quite short. There are three things. One is doing some audit, which my colleagues are doing. The next thing is to get some emerging standards for algorithms. And the third one, which is a chair committee that's been looking at setting up a national algorithm certification service, and people are quite supportive of this across government, companies and academia. But I think the key thing is the word adopting. We need to grow these things. And the contribution I'd like to make is that I think that government departments, and particularly regulators, could actually be a good way to actually promote best practice. So if the OSR could take the lead in getting the other regulators, I think there are 60 different regulators in the UK, to start looking at algorithms, also automating as well. I think it's a great opportunity for government to take the lead in this, in the same way that Shaquille has been doing in HMRC. And this might be a way to actually, firstly, to get the other regulators to appreciate the impact that algorithms are going to have on them, and secondly, to actually, you know, set a path for companies to follow with best practice. That's all I wanted to say. Back to the chairman.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that, Philip. We've got a few questions coming in now, and I'd just like to start off with a question about regulation versus voluntary codes of practice, or voluntary standards and frameworks. Which is the preferred option and why? So regulation versus a voluntary code of practice. And could I ask Philip to attempt that one, please?
Yes, I think it follows on from what I'm saying. The best way to do innovation is to do some experiments and sort of grow things. So I think we all agree we need regulation. But I think starting off, you try and find out, you know, what we should do, and because algorithms are still emerging, you know, I know there'll be billions in, you know, maybe 10 years, but the best way is to try a few things, you know, with organizations and see what works. That's it. I was thinking when you were reading out the question about if you've got a park, how do you find out where to put the paths? It's very easy. You don't put any paths down, and after a few months you'll see where people have walked, and then you can lay the paths. I probably everybody thinks it's a stupid analogy, but anyway, it's a good way to actually make sure that you actually put things where people want them and that they work.
Thank you for that, Philip. And very quickly, Ed, as a regulator, you know, your views on the same question would be really interesting to hear.
I suppose the way I put it is this, Shaquille: all regulation takes place not for its own sake, but to achieve some outcome, some goal. And effectively, the job of the regulator is to create the incentives and the expectations that organizations act to align with that goal. Now, if they're going to do that anyway, because they're voluntarily choosing to do so, that's fantastic, because the architecture of regulation isn't required. The sort of heavier hand of regulation isn't required. People are doing the right things in the public interest anyway. I think where regulation comes in is where it's clear that the organizations concerned are not acting in that way that sort of aligns with the overall outcome, where you need the sort of the force of regulation. So I agree with Philip that you actually want to start with a voluntary approach, because that's fits experimentalism. And I also think you want to start giving people the opportunity to do things which leads to the good outcome anyway, but always keeping in mind that that might not be enough, and you might need the kind of firmer recourse of formal regulation if the voluntary approach proves to be limited. So I suppose I think they coexist probably in that sequence.
Yeah, so I guess what we're saying is having a voluntary code will promote that innovation, and maybe somewhere down the line regulation would be needed, but not necessarily at this moment in time.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I'll just move on to questions that are coming in. One of the questions, do you think part of the challenge is educating the public procurers of digital products on how to interact with data and AI? So David, would you like to have a go at that question?
Yes. I think we've all seen mistakes made when people don't understand the limitations of the data they've got for answering the questions or carrying out the operations they want to carry out, and as a consequence make mistakes. And exactly the same applies with algorithms. In fact, there is a case to be made that the 2008 financial crash occurred largely, or at least partly, because the senior managers in banks just didn't understand the limitations of algorithms, didn't understand that models were merely models, were not the reality. And so I think the short answer to this question is very much so. We do need to educate the public insofar as we can, but certainly procurers and users of these products need to be educated in their limitations and how to use them.
Fantastic. Yeah. So I've got plenty of questions coming in here. Another one, regarding interpretability of AI models, is this also being considered in terms of regulation and developing frameworks? Any takers for that question?
I mean, a general comment that, of course, interpretability is a hot topic at the moment, and there are sound reasons for it. Not only does it reassure people if you can, as it were, interrogate an AI system and say, why have you come to this conclusion? But there's also, it's also pretty clear that the systems are more effective, make better decisions if they are vulnerable to being interrogated. This is, if you like, them establishing their trustworthiness. You know, if they have to answer the question, why do you make this decision? Then they have to be able to answer that question, which makes them more trustworthy.
Yeah, I was just gonna draw on the same point as David, really. Yeah, I mean, interpretability definitely is being considered, at least, you know, within OSR and kind of our remit and how we regulate. You know, definitely thinking about that, just things to consider. But you've also, and I think the ICO kind of put this point across as well in their documentation with the explainability as well, is it really does depend on context as well. You know, interpretability in one context may be completely necessary. So in a kind of medical context, you'd want to be able to explain, you want to be able to understand what's going on. Maybe if you're talking about marketing, potentially, you know, not so much.
I'm just going to say, in two areas where there's a big impact of algorithms, financial services and recruitment, there are significant laws that you know, companies can be heavily fined if they break them, and therefore interpretability and being able to, you know, whether it's related to a loan or an appointment, is at the forefront of the company's concerns, obviously.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for that. I'll move on to another question. How to deal with biased data if this data reflects reality? In South America, low-level education is related to crime. David, what are your thoughts on that particular question?
I'm trying to begin by sort of making the observation that there's no such thing as biased data in an absolute sense. It's always biased relative to some sort of question you want to answer, or something you want to find out, or to some population to which you mean to make an inference. So, you know, if I want to make an inference to the entire population of the UK, just getting my sample from people in nightclubs would probably not be very effective. But if I wanted to make a statement about people who went to nightclubs, it would be effective. So I think one has to begin with that. There's no such thing as biased data. You know, biased data can reflect reality. It depends what reality you're trying to understand. How to deal with it if you've got a sample which you recognize. Yes, I have a very short answer to this. How to deal with it if it doesn't reflect the population, the reality that you want to model? Well, my book, Dark Data, tells you exactly how to do that.
Excellent. Yeah.
Shaquille, can I just add something to that, which I think there's clearly a responsibility on the organization that is using AI on training data to ask itself that very question about what might be the biases embedded in my data. And a lot of the quality assurance I think we apply to AI tools will be interrogating that question. But I think it's also worth saying that one of the good things about AI is that it can actually make some of the inherent biases in existing data and existing structures more transparent, can expose them in a way that if they just sort of exist in their heads of decision makers, human decision makers, they never get exposed. So I think that it's a very significant worry, certainly, but I think there's also a route to say, actually, there's something in the AI process that can reveal the biases inherent in existing data as well, which is a healthy process.
Yeah. And I guess, Ed, Emily, you were talking a lot about kind of the trust of algorithms in the public space. And in that context, what would you say, what are the particular challenges of demonstrating trust from a government application perspective versus an industry one? So maybe some of the work that you're doing with the exams algorithm, for example, Emily, Ed, what your kind of comparison would be between government applications and industry?
I'll give a quick answer to that, and then maybe Emily, you can follow up. I think that my perception is that as a citizen, people have very, very high standards that they expect in terms of the openness and transparency and explainability of the decisions that affect them. So they will expect the right of appeal. They will expect things to be explainable. They will expect to really feel as though the decision that's being made is entirely fair and unbiased. I don't know whether those expectations are as strong for some consumer contexts when people are acting as consumers in a market. I may be wrong about that. That may be just my wrong perception. But it seems to me the bar is quite high for public sector organisations, and perhaps rightly so. And it follows from that I think the very hardest thing for a public sector body using an AI application is understanding how to test public acceptability. Before the thing hits the headlines, are there ways to think through how will the public react to this when they learn that the decision about them has been the product of a machine, so to speak, as opposed to the product of a human process? Testing that public acceptability, I think, is a huge challenge, and I think practice is developing at present. It's not very well developed as to how to address that.
I think
Emily.
I was going to say, Ed, I think you've highlighted the points that I was going to make quite clearly there. I was going to say that I personally think that the bar within government and public sector organisations is a lot higher with trustworthiness and transparency as well. I think the more government departments can be more transparent about what they're doing, can be open about what they're doing, and open about the kind of checks that they're putting in place as well. What kind of human in the loop have they got? And I think it'll just kind of increase the trust within government. But I do think, like Ed said, I think the bar is definitely higher in government than it would be in the private sector, just for that reason. In that it feeds into public policy, and it affects people's lives and decisions made about them.
Yeah, I think that sounds really credible. But I guess a lot of the expertise does lie in industry. Another question leading on from that is, how do we draw the expertise from industry to improve and build that trust in the algorithms we build in government? And I guess alluding to using this mechanism of triple helix. So I guess, Ed, maybe there's been projects in the past where we've involved industry to build our capability in government. Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly have been, and there's no question that there's a huge reservoir of expertise in the private sector. And I think the public sector needs to recognise that its capabilities are probably lower here than in the private sector. But I think there is another side to the coin, Shaquille, which is that public sector bodies have centuries of experience of dealing with this public engagement point. It's what, you know, public bodies are always in the eye of sort of public consensus in a way, yeah. And they face these challenges and sometimes these storms. And I think there's a reservoir of experience of that as well. So I wouldn't see the learning as all being one way.
Definitely, yeah. And I think the Triple Helix advocates learning from all directions, really. I'm just being told that we're running out of time. We've literally got 1 minute left. So on that note, apologies we weren't able to answer all the questions. We will answer the questions directly online. So on that note, I'd just like to thank all my fellow presenters and panelists for their contributions. And do, as I say, contact@validateai.org. Please send any messages regarding the presentation or whether you'd like to collaborate in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.